We're going to go ahead and get started. There'll be other people coming in with plates to do college for the long line. It's great. We got a good turnout. We're very happy about that. And feel free, by the way, it won't bother either one of us if you go back for seconds. I think there's more out there. Welcome to Water Law in the 21st Century, a fireside chat with Tanya Trujillo. Tanya just stepped down from a high-level position in the Biden-Harris administration, working on water issues. My name is Kevin Washburn, and I will be the inquisitor or the moderator here for Tanya's visit this evening. This talk is sponsored by the Hubble Environmental Law Initiative, which is interested in addressing all sorts of environmental issues, but especially those related to water here in Iowa and beyond. And this is an important subject. Water is life, after all. Let me turn to the person sitting next to me. Tanya Trujillo has had a very successful career in water law since she graduated from Iowa Law in 1992 after first getting her undergraduate degree from Stanford out in California. She spent her entire career pretty much working on water issues. In addition to her recent stint as Assistant Secretary for Water and Science at the Department of the Interior, she had previously worked at the United States Senate as a chief staffer on the Senate's Natural Resources Committee. She worked in the Obama administration. We worked together at the Department of the Interior during the Obama administration. She's also worked, though, she's been a partner in a big private law firm, Holland and Hart, out west, and she has worked for the Interstate Stream Commission. She's worked at the state level, in other words, too. So she's worked both at the federal and the state level. Most recently, she concluded this in Washington, D.C. as Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, where she oversaw the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Geological Survey. Following that service, she has just returned back to her frequent home, the place she always goes back to, which is Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so we are really lucky to have her here. And we thought this was a great time to have her here for a frank conversation because water issues have been pretty stressful lately, especially out west. And she was right in the middle of all that stuff. And water in the 21st century is broad enough for us to cover a lot of different ground. We have a lot of students here. So would you just tell us a little bit about how you ended up going down this interesting path?
Sure thing. Thank you, Dean Washburn, and thanks to everyone here at the College of Law. It's great to be back. As the Dean said, I was a student here and graduated 30 years ago. So it's good to be back in these hallways and to be able to have a conversation, I hope, with you on these issues. I graduated from law school and went directly to New Mexico, where I split my time growing up between New Mexico and Des Moines, Iowa. And I think that kind of gave me the experience of having diametrically opposed environments to grow up in. And being from New Mexico, I had a strong appreciation for the value of water and the role that water plays in the environment, and was able to go back right after law school and practice in a small firm working on natural resource issues, primarily litigation based. And after about 12 years of private practice, I was asked whether I wanted to work for the state of New Mexico as general counsel for the Interstate Stream Commission. And that's something that state of Iowa doesn't have a similar agency or a similar opportunity here, but in the Western states, there are several interstate agreements relating to sharing water resources, and I had the opportunity to work full-time on those issues for the state, and that kind of kicked me off as a full-time water lawyer, and since then I've been able to kind of move back and forth from federal service, state service. I had a stint in philanthropy and nonprofit work, which was really interesting as well. I was asked to volunteer on the Biden-Harris transition team, and that led to a job as an appointed official in the Senate confirmed position with the Department of the Interior, working on water and science issues. And after that, I have returned back to New Mexico, where I'm working in a position as a water policy advisor to the governor of New Mexico, and in a role as the deputy state engineer. So just kind of throughout my whole career, I've been able to work as a lawyer, but very closely with technical experts on engineering issues, hydrology issues, biology issues, economics, and all of the cross-pollination that we have in these various fields. So thanks to my great education here at the College of Law, I've been able to do quite a few really, really fun things. And again, looking forward to a conversation with all of you.
I didn't pay her to say that, I swear. So you were the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, and I understand you oversaw the Bureau of Reclamation and U.S. Geological Survey. How many people know what the Bureau of Reclamation does? Show of hands. Okay, a handful, small handful. How about the U.S. Geological Survey? How many people know what they do? Okay, more. Interesting, more. Some of you may have something on me on that, because I'm not sure I fully know. Will you explain both of the agencies just so that people understand the mission of these two related entities that sort of reported up to you?
Sure thing. And maybe just generally, the Department of the Interior is one of the agencies in the federal government, and the Secretary of the Interior is a member of the President's cabinet. And then within Interior, there are several, well, not several, a few, 5 different assistant secretaries with various responsibilities over different subject matters. I was the assistant secretary with responsibility over water and science, and generally the water side is what relates to the Bureau of Reclamation, which is a Western focused bureau responsible for managing the infrastructure and water flows of most of the major rivers in the Western United States. And that agency, that bureau has about 5,000 employees throughout the 17 Western states, and really has a broad range of responsibility for distributing water, for analyzing the forecasting of water, so how much supply is going to be available, working very closely with other federal agencies on that, and importantly, working very closely with the non-federal agencies in the states or the tribes in the Western U.S. And then on the science side, the USGS has responsibility on a nationwide basis, and they have probably doubled the number of employees, about 10,000 employees throughout the United States, working on a broad range of science issues, from biology to geology to hydrology, and really intersecting with all of the other federal agencies on the science work that they have underway, and very, very many agreements with non-federal entities as well. So thinking collaboratively about how to utilize science to help impact and influence the decision-making that's going on at the federal level, and with many of the state and non-federal partners as well. So incredible range of experience that they have, everything from monitoring volcanoes around the world to investigating the minerals and oil and gas and natural resource deposits that exist around the world as well. So really a broad range of expertise that they have that they're working on a daily basis.
So since this discussion is water in the 21st century, I'm going to focus more on the Bureau of Reclamation side, although I gather USGS did some work related to water as well. Is water policy driven mostly by science or by law?
That's a fair question. All right, I could answer in a lawyer way saying it depends. But I think, in my experience, which I think is pretty typical of a water lawyer's experience, it is very, very much a combined effort between law and science. And many of the challenges and many of the solutions that go along with the challenges require expertise from both of those arenas. I think, the analysis that's necessary to help influence either the laws or the court decisions relating to water use 100% depend on the science and that underlying science to help with the decision making. So it's a fun field to be in if you're interested in those subjects.
My sense is there have been a lot of lawyers in charge of the Bureau of Reclamation or your position. My sense is there hasn't been a lot of lawyers running the USGS. I think there'd be a revolt if you put a lawyer ahead of USGS.
No, I didn't brush up to answer that question. I don't know if there have been lawyers there. I would guess not. But again, it's a great opportunity to work collaboratively and think really how to deal with some of these challenges. And climate change is a great example because you have the constant dynamic system of having to be able to respond, whether it's with respect to water, droughts or floods, and try to manage that. It's always interesting.
So I'm going to turn to the Colorado River. Anybody have a question about anything she's talked about yet?
I was going to make a pitch. If there are already lawyers who are interested in science, it's a great opportunity to go and be the directors.
One of the most stressful issues our country has faced is drought in the West, and specifically the gradual reduction in the flow of the Colorado River that's been charted by Nobel Prize winning climatologists. The issue came up in your confirmation hearing, at least in your QFRs I saw, the questions after the hearing that you had to follow up with, and it became even more acute as the drought worsened. And then it got a little bit better last year because we got a lot of snow. We got those atmospheric rivers out west and lots of snowfall and snowpack, and it sort of saved us at least for a little while, perhaps partially. Hammering out an agreement as to the dwindling water supply on the Colorado River has been really difficult. Can you set the stage for how it came to be set up the way it is, the Colorado River, and who gets how much water and all that? Give us a little bit about that.
You bet. And this could be, a month-long seminar on this subject. But I think maybe let me preface it by saying, it's not just the Colorado River Basin that's kind of impacted by the declining trend in water availability. We've seen across the country a trend towards hotter, drier temperatures or more erratic storm systems. And the Colorado River Basin is an area that has been impacted, particularly around throughout the past 20 years or so, from a declining supply that's available. And the reality is the water users and the entities that share the resources of the Colorado River Basin have had to figure out ways to respond to that. And I've had the luxury personally of working on those issues from a number of different perspectives over the past 20 years, and I've been involved in many of the agreements that are currently in place and that are the bedrock for the new set of agreements that will be developed. I think it's an example of a stream system that's gotten an incredible amount of media attention, particularly over the past couple of years, where we were facing truly unprecedented conditions. And I don't say that for lightly, because you always think, well, we can find an example somewhere of a similar circumstance, but it was back to back some of the driest conditions that had ever been seen in that basin and in other places in the country. And we were truly facing emergency operational conditions where the engineers in charge of these facilities had said, we've never operated under these conditions. We need to figure out ways to slow down the decline. And as you know, there's supply and demand, and on the demand side, you have more direct ability to control that side of the equation. So we were able to take measures to reduce water usage on an emergency basis, while we gave the engineers and operators some more time to think through some alternatives of how to reconfigure the system. But it really does involve the coordination with among a number of different entities and all sectors. So agricultural water users have to be involved, municipal water users have to be involved, and you have to think through some water sharing alternatives that are necessary during those really dry times.
So I know this is driven by the Colorado River Compact. Can you tell a little bit about that? What is the Colorado River Basin?
You bet. And so the Colorado River Compact is a legal agreement among the 7 states that share the water from the Colorado River, and the states are divided generally into 2 categories: upper basin states, which are Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, and lower basin states, which are Arizona, Nevada, and California. Also involved in that equation is the Republic of Mexico. It's an international river, and the U.S. has a treaty obligation to deliver water to Mexico on an annual basis. And then the federal government is involved in this because it is an interstate agreement, and because there are massive federal infrastructure elements, giant dams, Hoover Dam, and Lake Powell and Lake Mead, that have to be managed on an annual basis, that are owned and operated by the federal government. So those are the basic players. You might notice I didn't mention tribes. There are 30 different tribal nations within the Colorado River Basin that also share the waters of the river system and have to be involved in these types of discussions that we're currently having, but they have not always been part of that conversation. And back in 1922, when the 7 states and the United States entered into the compact in the basin, there were no tribal parties that were participating in those discussions. So 100 years later, we're trying to correct that situation.
Now, I've toured that Hoover Dam, and they said it was the best dam tour in the country. They're joking on mine. I still. How does the federal government run the Colorado River? What's the infrastructure available to the federal government to do that work?
Well, from a legal perspective, so in 1922, you had the agreement among the states and the federal government to share the water of the system, and it's not a very precise compact. It basically divides between the upper basin and the lower basin, but not much specificity as to how much each state is entitled to. But not long after that, in 1928, the federal Congress enacted a law that allocated water among California, Arizona, and Nevada, and authorized the construction of Hoover Dam. And so that massive infrastructure created Lake Mead, and essentially there's a regulated river below Hoover Dam for the major water users in the lower basin. But notwithstanding the specificity in that 1928 statute, there were still ambiguities and conflicts that existed primarily among Arizona and California. So Arizona sued California, and the water users in each of the states were battling each other for clarification on how much water was entitled to be used in the lower basin. That Supreme Court litigation went on for around a decade, and the initial decree was finalized in 1964. There were some supplemental decrees after that, but the 1964 decree confirmed the allocations among the states and enjoined the Secretary of the Interior from operating the river, I'm getting back to the question, from operating the river except in accordance with that decree. And so there are very specific rules and definitions in the decree that still, however many, 50 plus years later, are directing and guiding the operation of the river. And so the Secretary of the Interior has to follow the rules of the Supreme Court, which interpreted the congressional acts, and that's the model that's still being followed. That was just an example of a lower basin situation. In the upper basin, there's a similar situation with respect to construction of these massive reservoirs that help regulate the flow of water among the states and the tribes, and have specific rules associated with each of those reservoirs as far as how they're operated. So it's back to your question about science or law, right? There's rules to follow, but you have to utilize the resources that are available in order to make sure you can operate the infrastructure.
So as a practical matter, there's somebody at each of those dams to turn the dial or something like that, determine how much water is released and goes downriver.
Yep, there are operators, there are managers, there are accountants who are measuring the flow back to the USGS role. USGS plays an incredibly important role throughout the country, and including the Colorado River system of measuring the flow in several places. So keeping tabs on all of the different moving knobs and flow of water is a really big problem.
So those states are really stressed out right now, especially the lower basin, I gather, because the Colorado River is so important. I think a lot of us saw in the media within the past year or so that one of the kind of suburbs in the Phoenix area, their supplier cut them off with water, and the supplier was another municipality, I gather. But is that a direct result of this water scarcity in the Colorado River?
I think you're accurately describing the reality of the Colorado River in the lower basins of California, Arizona, and Nevada is an incredibly important source of water. That's a surface water supply. Another important source of water in all three of those states is groundwater. And so many communities, like where I'm from in Santa Fe, New Mexico, have a conjunctively managed system. So they have surface water and groundwater together in an interconnected way. And depending on the available supply of surface water, you may use more of that and less of groundwater. And, if you have less surface water, you would rely more on groundwater. And in some communities, there is no available surface water, so they would have to rely 100% on groundwater. It's, again, the science of that is such that there might not be a reliable supply of the groundwater, and it's not recharged by surface water. So it's something that is always a fragile situation. I think your reference to communities that are running out of water is a real concern if they haven't taken measures to appropriately plan for the future supply that they may need. And I think some of those examples have involved mismanagement, frankly, of not having the ability to provide reliable water supplies in circumstances that may have been foreseeable in the past.
So we didn't practice this, so it's okay to say I don't know, or I don't want to answer that. But I noticed that California rejected a desal. I mean, they got the Pacific Ocean right; it's right there. It borders the whole state. Why, I noticed that they rejected a desalination, process or plant that they were thinking about developing. Do you know why? I mean, what are the costs and the disadvantages of desal? Why don't we take from the ocean? The ocean seems to have plenty of water.
Part of a municipality's supply could include reused water or desalinated water. And in California, there is what I was describing earlier. There's a combination between surface water that's used, groundwater that's used, and in many places recycled water. In some places in California, they have utilized desalination, ocean desalination for a component of the supply. Typically, it's more expensive than other potential sources, and there's always a concern with the permitting and the environmental impacts associated with that process, particularly with respect to the discharge. And so I don't know the particulars about the example that you were raising, but I know that it is something that a community probably would go forward with if they basically didn't have another option, because it is more expensive and more cumbersome to do that. But again, the basic combination of supply and demand may lead to utilization of that potential source in the future if there's not other available sources of supply.
So let me turn to irrigation a little bit. We all know what a farmer is, but in the world of Western water, we don't call them farmers, we call them irrigators, right? That's the word. I mean, that's the euphemism for farmers. We call them irrigators, right? Here in Iowa, we don't really call them farmers either. We often call them producers. I don't know why, they're farmers, but we call them producers or operators sometimes even. In a world here in Iowa, not just severe drought and not just extreme drought, the newspaper the other day had something even beyond those two. Exceptional drought, I think maybe it was. Some of our farmers in Iowa are not, they're thinking about not just being producers, but becoming irrigators, becoming more like Western farmers. I know that you aren't necessarily an expert in agriculture, but I've heard you talk thoughtfully about these issues. What do we know about irrigation and what have we learned? And I mean, what would, if Iowa starts to turn more to irrigation, any sense of what that might look like based on your experience out west?
That's an excellent question, but I did note when I was driving over yesterday on NPR, the state of Iowa climatologist was on talking about the drought conditions that do exist here in Iowa, and the entire state is subject to at least some level of drought conditions, and some of the areas have reached the highest level of drought designation. So it's a concern again to the communities that are relying on that, including the farmers / producers. So in the West, much of the irrigation, much of the agricultural production stems from having diversions off of the surface water systems to provide water for agriculture, and that is through irrigation. So could you develop through engineering or through construction efforts systems here in the Midwest to do a similar practice? You certainly could. Now, how that would come about would probably require either state law or federal law or agreements as to how to avoid adverse impacts to the communities that are relying on that surface water supply now. And that type of analysis is built into the basic structure in the Western states of how to manage water resources. And I am not sure about Iowa, but I don't know that there's a similar type of a foundation of law for how to evaluate impacts of one water user who may be constructing something that would adversely impact a neighbor. So if there'd have to be a lot of development taken into consideration for how to think about that. But the climate realities may force some of those more creative or novel types of scenarios.
So I happened to drive from Santa Fe to Iowa City about 3 months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, after dropping a kid off in college in Arizona. And one thing I noticed was we passed into really about the Oklahoma Panhandle, and we started seeing central pivot irrigation systems, those big round, you see them from an airplane. They're in Oklahoma, and they're in Texas, and they're in Nebraska. You don't see that many of them here in Iowa, but you see a few. Are those wasteful? I mean, is irrigation seems like it's a wasteful use of water, but I mean, I'm sure we've been focusing on trying to improve that. Tell me more about that.
I think it's not my area of expertise per se, but I think the reality in the West is there have been engineering solutions for how to bring water across dry landscapes and use it to grow crops. And so, again, if that needs to be modified to fit another geography where typically you could rely on rainflow or groundwater resources or the natural hydrology. If that natural system is not providing the water you need, there may be efforts to try to manage the system through man-made solutions that are enable agriculture to occur through irrigation, and that could be flood irrigation is typically the most inefficient, but it also provides the most runoff back to the natural stream systems. There is sprinkler systems or drip irrigation, which is very efficient in terms of how much water you use per crop. And maybe I'll just say another thing. Another area where there's a lot of innovation happening is the measurement of the evapotranspiration. And literally they can do this on a satellite, from a satellite basis, and have a very, very efficient system evolving for irrigation because of that new technology that's evolving.
I know that there's a saying out west that water flows toward money, not downhill necessarily, but uphill even if necessary toward money. Now, they also say that what whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, right? All right. So I remember hearing someone say back in the Clinton administration that something like this: the dirty little secret is not that water is scarce, but it's just used for the wrong purposes. And the idea was that it's being used for highly consumptive uses like agriculture, when what we really need it for is cities like Phoenix. It was a perspective, and I think any of us that have read, has anyone read Cadillac Desert by Mark Reiser? Yeah, the basic thesis that some of you will remember is that people shouldn't live in the southwestern United States because there's no water there. That's basically the principle, and it's pretty compelling when you read it. But what's your thought about that, having kind of worked around the West about this idea that there is plenty of water, we're just using it for the wrong things?
I think, many places in the West, there has been a lot of compromise, and there's been a lot of effort to try to accommodate growth in the Southwest and accommodate the irrigation uses that have been going on as well. I think it's a situation where there's an awful lot of regulation involved, and I say regulation with a small r. So each state has a system of managing the use of water, which can be, it is tied to particular places of use and purposes of use, which means if you have a water right that you're using for agricultural use, you're not allowed to change that use unless you go through the administrative process to change it from an agricultural right to a municipal right. And so that system in place regulates the ability to transfer from one use to the other use generally, but there is the other reality of the population growth demands additional water supply, and so cities have had to figure out ways to utilize either groundwater or surface water that's transferred from one of the other types of uses in order to allow them to grow. But I will make the pitch for the third category, which is recycled water and reuse of water, which really is an element of the continued supply that municipalities can utilize and will enable them to be able to be sustainable, even if those other two categories are less reliable in the future. And so I think one of the elements you were thinking about was, you know, what's the market basis for allowing these transfers to occur? You know, who's going to pay who to do what in terms of the overall water balance, and that's something that really does depend on a place by place basis and varies according to the overall supply and the level of demand that may exist for the water.
Well, what if, I mean, you see crops being grown in the desert that maybe are highly consumptive, and people say, why are you growing cotton, or why are you growing oranges in the desert, or something like that? I don't know exactly everything, but thoughts about that. Can we control that? I mean, is there a way to stop those sorts of things?
These are really hard questions.
I think it's
well, I would invite, you know, input from folks, but that's a question because, you know, we in our country and in our world, in our country, we don't dictate who can grow what types of crop, and you know, it is a reality of tradition and of market values as to what crops are produced in what areas. I will say, you know, one thing that does make a difference is having a crop that is a permanent crop versus a more temporary crop. And if you have a permanent crop like trees, that's something, and that can be citrus trees or pecans or almond trees. Those are going to require annual amounts of water, as opposed to a more temporary crop like onions or carrots or alfalfa that you can apply water to on a variable basis. But farmers and producers usually grow crops because there's a market for the products that they are growing, and that market could be to your neighborhood farmers market, or it could be, you know, hundreds of thousands of miles halfway across the globe. And that's something that we don't regulate the production and the actual end market of that very much. But there's a lot of discussion about that.
I'm going to open it up for questions in just a minute. I'm going to ask one or two more, but we're going to invite conversation, and anybody that has any questions. One of the things that always struck when I moved here from New Mexico 5+ years ago, and I called back to New Mexico and I said, you know, they have rivers here, but you'd never recognize them because they're all covered with water. Do you take pictures of the One River, the Iowa River, to take back to show your friends in New Mexico, to show what the waters look like, the rivers look like out here?
I'll remind you, there is a drought here in Iowa too. And I think I did notice in driving over that the rivers are not completely full. So it's something to be mindful of, but it is definitely a different world. And you look on the satellite map of New Mexico and you see a pretty tiny green thread that goes to the middle of the state, which is where our biggest river, called the Rio Grande, is. And that river is a very hardworking river. It provides water for irrigation along that corridor. All of the biggest cities in New Mexico rely on that surface water supply. And last but definitely not least, the natural environment and for example, the flyway and the bird corridor that exists through the Southwest really relies on the availability of water to make sure that habitat stays healthy.
So one last question, then I'm gonna ask others, but I know that climate change, one of the impacts of climate change is forest fires out west. And I know that forest fires can be really bad for dams. And I know that the Bureau of Reclamation runs a lot of dams. So can you talk about the impact of, I guess, forest fires on managing rivers and dams and that sort of thing?
I was hoping you were gonna bring back fire, because this is the fireside chat, so. The reality of a hotter, drier west is that we have seen more forest fires, and actually my family ranch in New Mexico was in the middle of one of the biggest fires that our state had ever seen last year in 2022. And what happens, with respect to water supply is after that fire comes through, you have a very unstable situation with respect to the runoff and the silt that builds up in the water supply that goes to those essential rivers that are impacting, are providing benefits to the communities. So the infrastructure that's already managed on a very careful basis now is complicated. The management is complicated because you have the added concerns of the fire residue. What is being done to address part of that is to try to think proactively before there's a fire and work on watershed restoration and watershed management efforts. So how can you navigate and prepare hillsides, for example, for potential for fire. So watershed restoration and watershed management is a big effort that's underway in all of the western states, including by the federal agencies that own and operate some of these big reservoirs.
Is that expensive maintenance?
It is, and I think in general, a lot of the conditions that we're seeing, I said, we have unprecedented situations and unprecedented challenges. They're very expensive to be able to work through some of those challenges. There's a really big influx of new federal funding that's available to address some of these concerns. And so there's unprecedented resources in some cases available to address the unprecedented challenges. And watershed management is one of the areas where folks are thinking creatively and really trying to tackle these issues before you get to a fire situation or a crisis management situation.
Yeah. I'm going to over to the audience. Yes, Larry.
Great, thanks. Wonderful to hear your comments, Tanya. I really appreciate all the challenges related to water. I'll ask one that's a little bit more centered.
I'd like to ask a question that sort of centers on federal policy. You talked about the Colorado Compact and many other elements where many different constituencies are involved. But we think just about the federal government has a role through a number of departments on water-related issues. And oftentimes we have conflicting federal policy that's encouraging use of water in one way, while we are, challenging the water resource in another way. And so I think there's been conversations of the need for, Secretary of Water, Department of Water for the nation. I think one of the biggest challenges is, when we look at agriculture, and we've done a lot of watershed work in this state, but I would say that every day we wake up, we lose ground to the industrialization and intensification of agriculture across the Corn Belt. And so we talked about science leading or driving policy. The latency behind the policy and science divide is so long relative to the change in climate and the industrialization of agriculture that we're in a very kind of losing and challenging situation. So any comments on that would be appreciated.
One thing I would say is there are many layers of management involved in these issues. And so it takes, because the problems are so challenging, it does take a lot of coordination among the federal agencies that have a role. And you pointed out, it's not just the Department of the Interior, but Department of Agriculture plays a role. The Corps of Engineers manages things like the Mississippi River, which is now experiencing some unprecedented conditions. You know, a lot of different federal agencies have to coordinate, but they have to work hand in hand with the state and local and agencies and entities that have those responsibilities as well. And the more collaboration there can be, the more cooperation and sacrifice, honestly, the better off for all the constituents, regardless of which, you know, state you live in or which area of the divide you may be residing.
I guess just to push on that just a bit, you know, coordination and collaboration are great.
I'm not saying it's easy.
Yeah, just, you know, coordination and collaboration are great, but we're facing water-related issues that we are simply not prepared for. And, you know, we're going through exercises in Iowa about the potential of euthanizing hundreds of thousands of head of livestock because the choices between water and livestock are people, and we're simply not prepared to make those decisions. So I think the challenges are greater than the coordination and collaboration are ready for solutions. So thank you.
In no way, I think the issues are very challenging, and there's a lot of conflict involved. So I'm a lawyer, I'm a litigator, I'm never afraid of the possibility of having to be in court to try to resolve some of these issues. But usually it's better if you can be involved in deciding the conclusion and solutions, you know, firsthand, as opposed to leaving it to a third party to make those decisions. But I get it. I think it comes back to the need to have strong technical basis and to have a strong relationship between the policymakers and the technical advisors who are going to be able to help with the planning for how much potential supply there may be, or how unreliable the potential supply may be, in order to maintain the public responsibility of providing for the basic human needs, which include food production as well. So it's hard.
I like the idea of taking the Army Corps from the Department of Defense and the Bureau of Reclamation from the Department of Interior to create a new Department of Water. It'll never happen because those other agencies won't give that up. But it's a great idea in theory, except that after your second comment, I'm not sure who would want the job as Secretary of Water because it's too hard.
Well, you spoke of water demand and water supply. One way to bring those into some sort of equilibrium is through pricing. I'd be interested in knowing what the federal government's role is in pricing water and whether there are any policies that might achieve better pricing of water.
There is little federal policy. I'm trying to think if there's any federal policy with respect to that. And because it's one of those sacred local issues. So folks want to be in charge of their own water supplies and their own water resources. And so it is an area that has not been managed by the federal government. And I think that's where are the economics professors? Yeah.
Well,
Okay, there it is. It's a policy decision, and you know, we have a free market policy that doesn't have a grasp on how to manage it at that level.
So if I could just add one little thing, Northwest Iowa, the rural water districts up there sell water to farmers. The more water they use, the lower the rate is.
Yeah.
You know, so they get a reduced rate for the higher volume that they use, so it's completely against water conservation. And, you know, now the Ocheyedan River is run dry this week, so.
Many city systems do very same thing. Inverse pricing.
Yeah, and so in the West, it's the opposite. So the town that I live in New Mexico, you pay higher rates if you use more water.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your comments. I think it's everything that you've talked about with the different complications of federalism, I think are very interesting, but I was also curious about what the enforcement mechanism is for the treaty with Mexico and whether in these discussions with all the stakeholders, discussions with Mexico are primarily country to country, or they include the states at the table with the federal government and also the government of Mexico.
Great, well, that's one of my favorite topics, and that can also be another month-long seminar. But I think the treaty with Mexico relating to the Colorado River was entered into in 1944. And it also includes water supply and rules with respect to the Rio Grande. So that one treaty contains those two provisions. And in the Colorado River, the United States is required to deliver to Mexico 1.5 million acre feet of water every year. And there consistently, the U.S. has complied with that. The U.S. has met those requirements. The treaty contains language that says if there is an extraordinary drought, the U.S. can deliver less. And it doesn't define extraordinary drought, and it doesn't describe how much less can be delivered. So what has happened over the past 20 years is there's been an effort to try to work with counterparts in Mexico to decide how to do that sharing, shortage sharing. And so there are agreements in place that define the conditions that Mexico deliveries would be reduced. To answer your question, there is actually an agency that on the U.S. side is housed within the Department of State Department, that is called the International Boundary Water Commission. And there is a parallel side from the Mexico government. And that commission has engineers on both sides of the country, both sides of the border, that talk about water supply and management issues on a day-to-day basis. And so their job is to work on boundary water issues from the coast of California all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico at the end of Texas. And so they deal with Rio Grande issues and Colorado River issues. They deal with water quantity and water quality issues, quite a lot of water quality challenges along the border. And they have been able to work on sub-agreements that are not as formal as a treaty. They're called minutes. And the minutes are ways of describing how the interactions are going to be more defined. And it's been a pretty successful effort, but again, huge challenges with respect to the water management issues. And I'll just say, in contrast to the requirements on the Colorado River, where the U.S. delivers to Mexico, on the Rio Grande, Mexico has a delivery obligation to the U.S. And so that same provision of extraordinary drought exists in both components. And so if the U.S. says, well, we're going to short you on the Colorado River system, Mexico could say, okay, but we're in drought on the Rio Grande and we're going to short you on the Rio Grande system. So there's a complicated series of back and forth that have to go that are taken into consideration on an annual basis when they're working on the operations and the accounting for those rivers. Great topic.
Do you remember the Obama administration when we tried to get the Colorado River to actually reach the Sea of Cortez, which is where it's supposed to be, that pulse flow to try to blow it through? Because that 1.5 million acres doesn't actually, it doesn't actually reach, it's supposed to, Colorado River theoretically empties into the Sea of Cortez, which is that little spit of water that goes around Baja California. And we did that. The pulse flow opened it, but it was like a health thing, right, for the river.
Yeah, so there was a amended one of these agreements that was entered into specifically relating to environmental flows in the Delta in Mexico. And the US delivers 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico on an annual basis. There's a diversion dam right at the border that diverts the entire flow of the river to farms and cities in Mexico that they utilize for irrigation and municipal uses. So we developed an agreement that included a lot of input from the states in the US, the states in Mexico, NGOs on both sides of the borders, and federal government efforts to provide water to the environment, to the river, to allow the habitat to be restored. And that was 10 years ago. And that effort has been successful, and there's continued effort to try to rehabilitate some of that habitat. And there's a lot of monitoring that's been going on, and a lot of continued interest in reconnecting that system there in Mexico.
Thank you. We are at time, and I think somebody else may need the room. So can you join me in thanking Secretary? I'll ask you to stick around if you can.
Yeah,
If anybody has questions.
thanks very much for having me here. It's great to see so much interest, and I'm happy to stay and talk for a while.